Avery Lane stepped off the dusty bus and surveyed the sprawling Ridgewood Military Academy. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the brick buildings, the neatly trimmed lawns, and the sprawling obstacle courses. Everything about the campus exuded discipline: the symmetry of the buildings, the immaculate lawns, the distant sound of cadets marching in perfect formation. It was intimidating, but Avery had seen intimidating before. Her years as a Navy SEAL combat veteran had taught her to measure threats calmly, to observe before acting, and to blend into any environment without drawing unnecessary attention. At first glance, she didn't belong here. The other cadets were barely out of high school, fresh-faced, reckless, brimming with testosterone and arrogance. Avery, in her late 20s, moved with a composed and deliberate pace that betrayed her military background. Her uniform fit perfectly, every fold straight, every boot polished. She didn't rush. She didn't look around nervously. She simply walked, her gaze fixed forward, her posture upright, exuding quiet confidence. Whispers started immediately. The boys in the courtyard slowed mid-step to stare. "Who's the new girl?" one muttered under his breath. "I heard she's some kind of punishment transfer," said another, smirking. Rumors flew faster than the wind. Some said she had been kicked out of other academies. Some claimed she was too old. Some simply shrugged and labeled her a nuisance. Nobody suspected the truth. Nobody knew she was far more dangerous than any of them. As Avery made her way to the administration building, she noticed the occasional scowl from passing cadets. Alpha Squad, the Academy's notorious group of bullies led by Cadet Sergeant Mason Hale, took immediate notice. Mason, a tall, broad-shouldered cadet with a cocky smile and a permanent sneer, felt his ego prickle at the sight of her. A girl in his academy, older, seemingly calm and unflinching. The nerve of her. He whispered to his squad, "Watch her. She's going to get in our way." Avery wasn't oblivious to their scrutiny. She had learned long ago how to walk through danger without letting it see fear in her eyes. Her mind was a calm lake, reflecting the chaos around her without rippling. Every motion she made was precise, efficient, deliberate. She didn't engage with the whispers, didn't try to charm anyone, didn't announce her presence. To the cadets, she seemed almost fragile, a mistake waiting to happen. Her first day of training started with the usual drills, running laps around the courtyard, push-ups, pull-ups, and timed obstacle courses. While the younger cadets struggled to maintain pace, Avery glided through each drill with surprising ease. Her movements were controlled, her breathing steady, and her eyes unwavering. Alpha Squad noticed immediately. "She's showing off," Mason muttered. "She's trying to make us look bad." But Avery wasn't trying to make anyone look bad. She simply executed every movement with the precision of someone who had trained under life-or-death conditions. Every twist, every turn, every landing was controlled, practiced. The other cadets began to feel a mix of resentment and fear. They whispered behind her back, mocking her quiet demeanor, her serious face, her lack of need for attention. Mason's irritation grew with every step she took. By the afternoon, the bullying began. Cadets would trip her during drills, hide her gear, and throw subtle insults her way. Avery absorbed it all without retaliation. She didn't lash out. She didn't show anger. She merely noted the behavior, calculating and observing. This silence unnerved Alpha Squad. They were used to reaction. They thrived on it. The more she didn't respond, the angrier they became. Lunch in the cafeteria was no different. Avery sat alone, quietly unpacking her tray, scanning the room with measured interest. Cadets jostled past her, sneering, trying to start a conversation that she ignored. Mason's squad approached, circling her like sharks. "Hey, newbie," Mason said, leaning close. "You think you're better than us?" Avery met his gaze without flinching, her eyes calm, her lips forming a slight, polite smile. "I'm just here to do my job," she replied softly. The lack of fear in her voice was a knife to their egos. By the end of her first day, rumors had spread through the academy like wildfire. "She's a freak. She's too perfect. I heard she's dangerous." Avery returned to her dorm, her movements smooth, practiced. She unpacked her bag, laying out her gear with military precision. This wasn't her first time entering a hostile environment. She had been deployed in combat zones where every movement mattered, where a single mistake could cost lives. Ridgewood was nothing in comparison, but she needed to gather information, to understand the social landscape before acting. That evening, she stood at the edge of the academy's practice field, watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of orange and pink. Mason and his squad watched her from a distance, plotting their next move. They couldn't understand why she hadn't responded to their attacks yet. To them, she was just another target, but Avery was already several steps ahead, noting weaknesses, timing reactions, calculating consequences. Her mind drifted briefly to memories she rarely revisited, the nights spent in hostile territories, missions where one wrong step meant death, the weight of responsibility for her team's lives. Those memories were both a burden and a tool. They sharpened her senses, taught her patience, and instilled a calm that could never be shaken by teenage arrogance. She carried that calm now into Ridgewood, quietly preparing for whatever came next. As night fell, Avery lay on her bunk, eyes open, listening to the distant sounds of cadets laughing, shouting, and occasionally yelling insults at the dorms. She smiled faintly to herself. Ridgewood was predictable, just like every environment she had mastered before. The real question wasn't how the cadets would try to break her. It was whether they could survive the lessons she would silently teach them. And Avery had no intention of losing, not to them, not ever. By the end of her first 24 hours, Avery Lane had already made an impression, fearful, resentful, and utterly confused. The other cadets didn't yet know the truth. She wasn't a mistake. She wasn't weak. She wasn't just another new cadet. She was trained, experienced, and deadly in ways they couldn't yet imagine. And she was just getting started. The sun rose again over Ridgewood Military Academy, casting pale light on the orderly rows of dormitories and the sprawling drill fields below. Avery Lane moved with her usual precision, slipping quietly into formation as the other cadets adjusted their positions. She was calm, composed, seemingly unaffected by the stares and whispers that followed her like shadows. But behind her serene expression, her mind was alert, calculating, cataloging. Every cadet she passed, every glance thrown her way was noted. Ridgewood might have looked like a standard military academy, but to Avery, it was an entirely predictable battlefield of ego, pride, and weakness. Alpha Squad had spent the night simmering over the events of Avery's arrival. Mason Hale paced in the courtyard, hands on his hips, brow furrowed, his pride wounded by her calm and effortless mastery of the drills. His squad members, Shane, Cole, and Darnell, gathered around, their faces a mixture of fear, frustration, and awe. Mason's voice cut sharply through the morning air. "She thinks she can just walk in here and make us look like amateurs. Not on my watch." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We're going to make sure she regrets it." The squad nodded, eager to follow, their eyes glinting with the promise of humiliation. Avery was unaware of their exact plotting, though she had already assessed Mason as a volatile and insecure leader, prone to overreaction. She had spent enough years in hostile environments to know how arrogance and fear could drive people to extreme measures. She didn't need to see their plans, she already understood them. Still, she remained patient. No impulsive action. No unnecessary confrontation. Observing first, responding with precision later. That was the only strategy that ever worked. The morning drills began with standard obstacle courses, timed sprints, and combat exercises. Avery moved with effortless skill, completing each challenge in record time. Her landings were silent, precise, her form flawless. The other cadets noticed immediately. Whispers erupted across the field. "Who is she? How is she doing that?" Mason's face turned red. It wasn't just that she outperformed them. It was that she did it without even trying, without showing off, without a shred of arrogance. That was worse. Mason's ego couldn't tolerate it. By mid-morning, Alpha Squad began subtle sabotage. A shoelace was tied into a knot, a water bottle disappeared, a timing sheet mysteriously went missing. Each act was small, calculated to frustrate her without leaving clear evidence. Avery noticed immediately, not because she was offended or angry, but because she had trained in far more lethal environments. She didn't call attention to the sabotage. She didn't complain to instructors. She simply adjusted, adapted, and moved on, leaving the cadets increasingly baffled and frustrated. Lunch brought another round of silent tension. Avery carried her tray to an isolated table near the edge of the cafeteria. Mason and his squad lounged nearby, throwing her furtive glances and whispers. "Think she's all that?" Cole muttered, a smirk playing on his lips. "She's just a girl," Darnell added, though there was a hint of unease in his voice. Mason leaned in, his jaw tight. "Don't underestimate her," he hissed. "She's hiding something, I can feel it. We're not done yet." Afternoon drills were worse. Mason escalated the harassment. During a timed climbing exercise, he shoved Avery lightly, hopping to throw her off balance. But she landed perfectly, barely missing a stumble, and continued as if nothing had happened. The squad muttered in disbelief. Mason's frustration boiled over. He cornered her briefly, leaning close, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're untouchable, huh?" Avery looked up calmly, meeting his gaze without fear. "I'm just here to train," she said softly. Her tone carried no malice, no defensiveness, only an unshakable certainty that unsettled him even further. That evening the squad's tactics became bolder. They began whispering threats, arranging small accidents, trying to provoke a reaction. Avery remained serene, nodding everything. Every action, every weakness, every crack in their discipline was mentally catalogued. They had no idea that the woman they were targeting had been trained to anticipate, counter, and survive threats far deadlier than anything Ridgewood could throw at her. Mason, in particular, became obsessed. Every glance, every word from Avery was scrutinized, every calm response interpreted as mockery. As darkness fell, the cadets returned to their dormitories, tension simmering just beneath the surface. Avery, alone in her room, reflected on the day. Ridgewood was predictable. The cadets' weaknesses were obvious: pride, impulsiveness, fear of losing face. They didn't know how to recognize genuine skill when they saw it. She could have reacted to every slight, every shove, every insult, but that wasn't her style. The stronger you appear when calm, the more they underestimate you. And that underestimation would work in her favor. Meanwhile, Mason and his squad gathered in a quiet corner of the barracks, whispering furiously. Plans were drawn up, strategies devised to humiliate Avery further. "Tomorrow," Mason said, his tone low and dangerous, "we'll make her pay. She won't know what hit her." Cole and Darnell nodded, their eagerness thinly hiding their anxiety. They didn't realize that Mason's plan would play directly into Avery's hands. They didn't yet understand that she had survived far more than rooftop falls, far more than sneak attacks, far more than anyone at Ridgewood could imagine. That night, as Avery lay in her bunk, she didn't sleep in fear or worry. Her thoughts were focused, precise. She replayed the day in her mind, noting every insult, every shove, every glance. She considered the weaknesses of each member of Alpha Squad, calculating potential outcomes for every escalation they could attempt. The cadets had already demonstrated arrogance, impatience, and a lack of foresight. They were predictable, and predictability was a tool she knew how to exploit. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees surrounding the academy, carrying the distant sounds of laughter, shouting, and casual cadet life. Avery's gaze drifted to the window, watching the shadows stretch across the courtyard. She allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Ridgewood Military Academy, with all its rules, traditions, and hierarchies, was nothing compared to what she had faced in combat, and she had already begun her silent work. By observing, calculating, and remaining calm, she had turned the first day into her own battlefield, one she would win without raising her voice. Mason, on the other hand, lay in his bunk, restless, consumed by obsession. He couldn't understand how a single cadet, one he considered weaker, smaller, and inexperienced, had outperformed, outmaneuvered, and outlasted him in every exercise. His pride felt threatened in a way it never had before. He would make sure tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until she broke, that Avery Lane knew her place. What he didn't realize, however, was that she had already chosen her own rules, and those rules were far deadlier than his imagination. By the end of the second day, the tension at Ridgewood had shifted. Cadets who had barely noticed Avery now watched her with a mix of fear, admiration, and confusion. Whispers filled the hallways. She's too perfect. She's too calm. Who is she really? Mason stared after her, a storm of anger, fear, and obsession brewing in his chest. He didn't know what she was capable of, but he would soon find out. And when he did, Ridgewood would never be the same. Avery closed her eyes, resting for a few hours before the next day's drills. Her mind was clear. Her body was ready. She had endured far worse, and she would endure far more. But she knew something about Ridgewood that the cadets did not. Patience was her greatest weapon, observation her shield, and strategy her deadliest tool. The next move in this silent battle belonged to her. And tomorrow, Mason Hale would step into a game he could never win. Night had fallen over Ridgewood Military Academy, cloaking the campus in a thick, almost suffocating darkness. The stars were obscured by clouds, and a faint wind whispered across the rooftops and hallways, carrying the distant sounds of cadets winding down their day. Avery Lane moved through the shadows with the quiet precision of someone entirely comfortable in hostile territory. Her mind was alert, her senses sharpened, cataloging every movement around her. She knew Alpha Squad was planning something. She could feel their intent, the weight of their jealousy, and the pulse of their desperation. Alpha Squad, led by Mason Hale, had spent the day plotting their ultimate humiliation. Every minor act of sabotage and insult had failed to provoke Avery. That failure had transformed their frustration into dangerous obsession. Mason whispered to his squad in hushed tones as they crept across the training building's roof. "Tonight, we finish this. We make her feel what she's done to us. She thinks she's untouchable. Let's show her she's not." Shane, Cole, and Darnell nodded nervously, their bravado masking the unease they felt. Avery, stationed on the practice yard below, paused briefly to observe the roofline. Her trained instincts caught the subtle movements of the squad above, the slight shifting of weight, the small vibrations on the roof tiles, the faint outlines of their figures against the moonlight. She wasn't surprised. She had been in combat zones where ambushes were common, where predators lurked in shadows. Her calm demeanor masked the readiness coiled within her muscles. She didn't panic. She didn't retreat. She simply prepared to respond. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Mason and his squad cornered her on the roof of one of the academy's administrative buildings under the guise of a late-night inspection drill. The roof was slick from earlier rain, and the edges were perilously close to a sheer drop of nearly 30 feet. Avery's mind quickly calculated trajectories, landing spots, escape routes. Every cadet had a weakness. Every position had a vulnerability. Mason didn't know that he had just walked into the wrong environment, into the presence of someone who had survived far worse than a rooftop shove. Mason approached, his face a mixture of anger, fear, and adrenaline. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he spat, his hand gripping Avery's shoulder. The other cadets circled around her like wolves, their sneers illuminated by the pale moonlight. "Tonight you pay," Mason hissed, stepping closer to the roof's edge. Avery's eyes followed every subtle movement, reading their intentions in ways the others could not comprehend. Her lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The confrontation escalated in an instant. Mason shoved her violently toward the edge of the roof, shouting, "Die, B*TCH." The world seemed to tilt, a cold rush of wind sweeping past her as she tumbled backward over the edge. For a heartbeat, the cadets below heard nothing. Then the silence became unbearable. Their bravado vanished instantly. The world held its breath as they imagined the fatal consequences of their actions. They expected a scream, a crash, a broken body at the foot of the building. Instead, nothing. Minutes stretched like hours. Avery didn't hit the ground. There was no sound of impact, no movement to betray her presence. The cadets froze in place, panic etched on their faces. Where is she?" Cole whispered, his voice trembling. Shane's knees weakened. Mason's mind raced in disbelief, terror twisting through him. He had seen her fall, he had pushed her. She should have been dead or at the very least screaming in pain. Yet Avery was gone. A sudden rustle drew their attention. Avery appeared silently behind them, her movement so smooth, so controlled, that it seemed impossible. She stood there, unharmed, calm, and entirely composed. Her hair was damp from the slick roof tiles, but her uniform was immaculate. Her eyes scanned each cadet, measuring them in a way that made them shrink inward. She didn't speak at first. She didn't accuse. She simply observed, letting the weight of the silence do the work that words could not. Mason staggered back, his mouth opening and closing without sound. How did you?" he stammered, fear overtaking his anger. Avery's gaze met his, unwavering, steady. "Your watch rotation is slipping," she said softly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had seen more death and chaos than they could imagine. Every syllable sent a chill down the spines of the cadets. They had underestimated her, and it was a mistake they would never forget. The rooftop fell into tense stillness. Mason's hands trembled slightly as he took a step back. Shane, Cole, and Darnell avoided Avery's gaze, suddenly aware of the sheer danger they had flirted with. It was no longer a simple matter of schoolyard bullying. They had attempted to push someone off a roof, and the cadet they had targeted had survived with ease, her composure unshaken. Their world had shifted. Fear replaced arrogance. Doubt replaced bravado. Avery didn't give them time to recover. With a fluid movement, she descended the fire escape with perfect control, landing silently behind a pile of crates near the training field below. The cadets watched in frozen disbelief, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Avery had survived a fall that would have injured or killed a normal person. She moved with the confidence of someone who had mastered every challenge life could throw at her, and every cadet on that rooftop now knew it. Once on the ground, Avery calmly began walking toward the barracks, her gaze flicking briefly toward the rooftop. Mason and his squad remained rooted in place, their faces pale and drained of color. The adrenaline that had powered their cruelty evaporated, replaced by awe and fear. They whispered to one another, uncertain whether to run or confront her. Mason's mind raced. He had underestimated her, completely, and for the first time he felt powerless. Hours later, as Avery rested in her dorm, Mason replayed the incident over and over in his mind. Every shove, every command, every taunt had failed spectacularly. He had faced her directly, attempted to humiliate her, even tried to instill fear, and yet she had emerged untouched, calm, and entirely dominant. A tiny seed of terror had been planted in him, one that would grow with every passing day she remained at Ridgewood. Outside the dormitory, the night wind carried distant echoes of cadet life, laughter, the occasional shout, the rhythmic beat of footsteps on pavement. Avery closed her eyes briefly, recalling the fall. It had been controlled, calculated, easy. She had used the momentum, the edge of the roof, and her own training to turn a potential danger into a non-event. That was what made her lethal, not aggression, not intimidation, but perfect composure under pressure. By the time dawn approached, Ridgewood Military Academy had shifted, imperceptibly but irrevocably. Avery Lane was no longer a passive presence. She had survived an ambush, defied expectation, and asserted dominance without uttering a single threat. Mason and Alpha Squad had glimpsed something they could not explain, a capability beyond their understanding. Fear had been planted, and respect, fearful, reluctant, uneasy respect, would soon follow. Avery lay in bed, listening to the quiet night settle over the academy. She thought about the cadets, their weaknesses, their predictable cruelty, and their pride. She didn't need to strike back yet. Observation and patience were her weapons. Every action, every shove, every whispered threat had been noted, logged, and analyzed. Ridgewood was no longer merely a military academy to her. It was a living puzzle, one she was already several moves ahead in solving. And Mason had no idea what he had unleashed. In trying to dominate her, he had revealed his own weaknesses, exposed his squad's arrogance, and inadvertently elevated Avery Lane to a status they could neither ignore nor challenge. They had thought they were predators. They were not. Avery was. The first major confrontation at Ridgewood had ended, but the battle was only beginning. The rooftop incident would not be forgotten. Mason would carry it with him every day, haunted by the memory of a fall that should have been fatal and the calm, unshakable cadet who had survived it. Avery, on the other hand, would continue to observe, calculate, and prepare. Patience was her ally. Discipline was her weapon. And the cadets of Alpha Squad would soon learn that underestimating her was a mistake they would regret more than anything else in their lives. The sun had not yet risen over Ridgewood Military Academy, but the events of the previous night hung over the campus like a heavy fog. Whispers moved through the barracks, carried on cautious voices. Did anyone see Avery after the fall? Where did she go? Cadets who had been bold, arrogant, and unafraid now walked cautiously, glancing over their shoulders. Alpha Squad, in particular, was rattled. Mason Hale sat on the edge of his bunk, staring blankly at the floor, replaying the rooftop confrontation in his mind. He had shoved her. He had shouted. He had attempted to humiliate her, and yet she had returned, unharmed, calm, untouchable. For Avery, the night had been uneventful in the way only someone trained to handle life-or-death situations could describe. She had landed lightly, using precise calculations of physics and momentum. She had rolled, absorbed the impact, and moved silently to a nearby fire escape, out of sight. Every motion had been deliberate, controlled, and exact. Where the cadets had seen chaos, she had seen opportunity, an opportunity to demonstrate not through words, but through presence that she was far beyond their understanding. By early morning, the campus buzzed with confusion. Mason and his squad had barely slept. Their confidence, once so bold and unwavering, had been replaced by fear, doubt, and unease. The other cadets whispered behind closed doors, imagining impossible scenarios. Maybe she's a gymnast. Maybe she climbed down somehow. But no explanation satisfied them. The idea that someone could survive such a fall, unscathed, calm, and composed, was unthinkable. Avery reappeared quietly during the morning assembly. She walked into the courtyard with the same deliberate calm she had shown every day since her arrival. No one spoke to her, though dozens stared. Mason's eyes followed her every step, his jaw tight. The physical fact of her survival was one thing, but the aura she carried now, control, composure, and absolute dominance, was something the cadets could not comprehend. It unsettled them in a way words could not express. During drills, Avery performed flawlessly as though nothing had happened. Each movement, each obstacle, each timed exercise was executed with perfect precision. The other cadets found themselves distracted, unnerved by her presence. Alpha Squad attempted minor acts of intimidation, whispering threats, making subtle gestures meant to provoke. Avery noticed everything. Her eyes scanned the field, reading intent, body language, and subtle movements. She did not respond with anger or aggression. She responded with stillness, with readiness, and with the quiet authority of someone who had mastered fear long before they had. Mason grew more desperate as the morning progressed. He had expected Avery to falter, to panic, to react with fear, or at the very least with anger. She had done neither. Her calmness frustrated him beyond reason. He cornered her during a short break, attempting once again to assert dominance. "You think you're untouchable?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. Avery met his gaze, unflinching. "I don't think," she said softly, "I just act." The words carried a weight he could not measure, a certainty he had never encountered in any cadet. By lunch, the whispers had turned to speculation. Other cadets talked quietly about what had happened, debating theories. Did she fall? Did she jump? Did she survive somehow? No one had an answer. Avery sat quietly, observing, her body language calm, her eyes alert. She had long since learned the art of moving unnoticed while remaining completely aware. The fear she inspired now was not overt. It was subtle, creeping, insidious. Mason could feel it gnawing at him, and it terrified him. Afternoon drills pushed the cadets to exhaustion, yet Avery remained unaffected. She executed every obstacle with ease, using minimal energy, maximizing efficiency. When Alpha Squad attempted to trip her or sabotage her progress, she adjusted without breaking stride. Each failed attempt on their part heightened their frustration and fear. Mason's shouting grew more desperate. He could feel control slipping. The other cadets began to sense that Avery was not just strong. She was precise, calculated, and untouchable. Later, during a tactical exercise, Avery demonstrated her unmatched agility and strategic thinking. When a simulated ambush was set up by Alpha Squad, she avoided it with a series of quick, precise maneuvers that left the cadets stunned. Shane whispered, "How did she do that?" Cole's face went pale. Mason's hands shook, and for the first time he truly feared her. Avery didn't gloat or explain. She didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered silently, and it hit harder than any words could. By evening, Mason convened his squad in private. "We're losing control," he admitted, his voice tight with fear and frustration. "She's not normal. We can't touch her. Every move we make, she's ahead of us. She knows everything we plan before we plan it." The other cadets nodded, pale and anxious. Their schemes, their harassment, even their rooftop ambush had all failed. Every attempt to intimidate Avery had only highlighted their own weaknesses. The fear of consequences, immediate, personal, and inexplicable, had replaced arrogance. Avery, alone in her dorm room that night, reflected calmly on the day. She had survived a fall from the rooftop, a feat that would have been impossible for most, and she had done so without losing composure. Ridgewood was beginning to understand the first rule of engagement with her: underestimate her at your peril. She reviewed the day's events in her mind, noting every cadet's weaknesses, every moment of hesitation, every act of arrogance or aggression. This mental catalog would guide her in the days to come. Meanwhile, Mason lay awake, haunted by the impossibility of what had occurred. He had pushed her off a roof. He had expected screams, chaos, perhaps even injury. None of it had happened. Avery had returned silently, unbroken, untouchable. He could not shake the image of her calm expression, the certainty in her gaze. It was unlike anything he had encountered, and the realization that she was beyond his ability to dominate sent a cold wave of terror through him. By the next morning, word of Avery's survival had spread throughout the academy. Cadets spoke in hushed tones, some incredulous, others fearful. Alpha Squad, once the dominant force at Ridgewood, had begun to fracture under the weight of doubt. Mason's authority, built on intimidation and physical dominance, had begun to crumble. Avery's calm, composed presence had revealed the limits of their arrogance, and the first seeds of respect, reluctant, fearful, but undeniable, had begun to grow. Avery's quiet dominance became increasingly apparent over the next few days. She never boasted. She never threatened. She simply existed with an authority that no one dared challenge. Her every move carried the weight of someone who had faced life and death countless times, someone who understood the consequences of failure and the value of discipline. For the cadets, it was a lesson delivered not with words, but with every action, every glance, and every silent calculation. Mason, for his part, became obsessed. He could not shake the memory of the rooftop fall, the silence afterward, or the calm presence she exuded. He began to question every decision, every strategy, every ounce of confidence he had ever had. Alpha Squad's unity faltered as they watched their leader falter. The dynamic at Ridgewood had shifted irrevocably. Avery Lane, quiet, composed, and seemingly ordinary, had become something entirely other, an impossible presence that could not be challenged, only endured. By the end of the fourth day, the academy had changed. Whispers followed Avery everywhere she went. Fear, respect, and fascination mixed in the cadets' minds. Mason and his squad understood on a visceral level that the rooftop ambush had failed not because of luck, but because they had underestimated her, something that in the world Avery inhabited could be fatal. And for Avery, the game was only beginning. She had observed, cataloged, and calculated. The cadets had made their first mistake. The next moves would be hers. The morning at Ridgewood Military Academy began with a tension heavier than any cadet had ever felt. The events of the rooftop incident had rippled through the academy like an invisible current of fear. Whispers, rumors, and speculation had taken root, spreading from dorm to dorm, echoing down hallways, and settling into every classroom. Cadets avoided Avery Lane's gaze, not out of politeness but out of an instinctive awareness that she was unlike anyone they had ever encountered. The air was thick with unease, and the Alpha Squad, led by Mason Hale, felt it most acutely. Mason had spent the entire night replaying the fall in his mind, his obsession growing with each passing hour. He could not reconcile what had happened. Every shove, every scream, every ounce of force he had applied should have resulted in pain, injury, or at least terror. But Avery had emerged unscathed, silent, and calm. He couldn't even understand how she had survived, let alone how she had returned as if nothing had occurred. His frustration was compounded by fear, a subtle, creeping terror that he could neither rationalize nor suppress. By mid-morning, an unusual energy coursed through the academy. Cadets noticed the sudden arrival of a vehicle in the front courtyard, black, official, commanding attention. Out stepped a man in a sharply pressed naval uniform, his posture rigid and authoritative. Commander Briggs, a high-ranking officer in the United States Navy, moved with the precision of someone accustomed to command. The murmurs among the cadets swelled as he strode purposefully toward Avery, his gaze locking onto her instantly. Even Mason, standing nearby, felt a chill run down his spine. Commander Briggs stopped a few paces away from Avery, and the world seemed to pause. His eyes, normally stern and commanding, softened in recognition. Without hesitation, he snapped to attention and saluted her. "Chief Petty Officer Lane," he said, his voice carrying authority and reverence. Avery returned the salute with calm precision, acknowledging the officer without altering her composed demeanor. The surrounding cadets froze, eyes wide with confusion and awe. Whispers turned into outright gasps. She's a Navy SEAL." Briggs turned to the academy commandant, his tone formal but tense. "She's here on assignment," he explained. Chief Petty Officer Avery Lane, decorated Navy SEAL combat veteran, recently reassigned to evaluate academy discipline and readiness. Her performance here is being observed under my supervision. The announcement struck the cadets like a thunderclap. Their jaws dropped, and a stunned silence enveloped the courtyard. Avery Lane, the cadet they had mocked, bullied, and attempted to push off a rooftop, was not merely capable. She was lethal, trained, and decorated beyond their comprehension. Mason's knees weakened. His mind scrambled, unable to process the reality in front of him. All the pride, all the arrogance, all the petty scheming. It had been nothing compared to the capabilities of the woman standing before him. Every move they had made, every act of cruelty, now seemed foolish, dangerous, and reckless. For the first time in his life, he felt small, insignificant, and powerless. Avery's calm gaze only magnified his inadequacy, reminding him that he had been utterly blind to her true identity. Commander Briggs approached the assembled cadets, his presence demanding silence and respect. "This cadet," he said, gesturing toward Avery, "is not here to be intimidated, to be bullied, or to be challenged in the ways you might expect. Chief Lane has survived combat zones, hostile environments, and situations where lives depended on precision, courage, and calm under pressure. Understand this. She is beyond ordinary measures of evaluation. Any attempt to undermine her will have consequences you cannot anticipate." The cadets were struck dumb. For the first time, Ridgewood felt small, insignificant, and fragile in the shadow of Avery's true capabilities. Whispers erupted again, now mixed with awe and fear. "She's a SEAL," one cadet muttered under his breath. "She survived what?" another asked, wide-eyed. Even the other cadets who had not participated in Alpha Squad schemes felt the shift in authority. Avery Lane was no longer merely a new cadet. She was a force, a presence that demanded recognition, respect, and most importantly, caution. Mason's hands shook slightly as he clenched them into fists. He had imagined consequences for Avery, embarrassment, humiliation, maybe a bruised ego, but nothing in his worst nightmares had prepared him for this revelation. She had survived rooftop falls effortlessly. She had defied expectation, ignored intimidation, and executed every exercise flawlessly. And now he understood why. She was not ordinary, she was extraordinary, and he had crossed her. Avery remained silent throughout the announcement. She did not gloat. She did not scold. She simply stood calm and measured, her presence alone conveying authority that no words could match. Every cadet, even those who had never met her before, understood instinctively that she was someone to be reckoned with. It was a presence born of experience, of survival, and of a lifetime of facing dangers far beyond the walls of Ridgewood. Commander Briggs stepped closer to Avery and spoke directly to Mason and Alpha Squad. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "Any attempt to intimidate, harass, or challenge Chief Lane will be met with consequences beyond the Academy's jurisdiction. You have been given a lesson in what real discipline, courage, and skill look like. Do not forget it." His gaze swept across their faces, lingering on Mason's, who felt a knot of dread twist in his stomach. The day continued, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Avery moved through drills with the same precision, the same calm authority, but now the cadets watched her differently. They respected her, feared her, and for some even admired her. Every glance, every motion, every calm expression reminded them that she was not merely a student. She was a teacher, a force, and a reminder of their own limitations. Lunch was quieter than usual. Cadets whispered cautiously in corners, casting glances at Avery that were hesitant and measured. Alpha Squad, once brazen and confident, huddled together, their collective arrogance diminished by the stark reality of who they had underestimated. Mason sat silently, staring at Avery from across the room, trying to reconcile the image of the cadet he had mocked with the reality of a decorated Navy SEAL. Every insult, every shove, every rooftop attempt now felt like a reckless gamble. By mid-afternoon, Avery's calm dominance was undeniable. Her movements were deliberate and precise, her interactions measured, and her demeanor unshakable. She had survived the impossible, and now everyone at Ridgewood understood that she was beyond ordinary comprehension. The rooftop incident, once a moment of tension, had become a lesson in humility, discipline, and respect. The cadets' whispered conversations were filled with speculation, fear, and reluctant admiration. Mason Hale, once the undisputed alpha, now felt powerless. His ego had been shattered, his authority undermined, and his confidence eroded. He watched Avery move through drills and briefings with ease, realizing that every attempt to dominate or intimidate her had failed spectacularly. And for the first time, he feared not just the consequences of her actions, but the knowledge that he had underestimated someone of unparalleled skill. As evening approached, Avery returned to her dorm quietly, her presence unchallenged, her authority absolute. The cadets, even those who had not directly confronted her, were transformed in subtle ways. They were wary, cautious, and increasingly aware that Ridgewood was no longer merely a school of discipline. It was a proving ground where true skill, courage, and composure had a voice far louder than arrogance or brute force. Mason sat on his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, a storm of fear, awe, and frustration churning in his chest. He understood finally that Avery Lane was no ordinary cadet, no ordinary competitor, no ordinary human being. She was a Navy SEAL, a combat veteran, and a master of discipline, observation, and strategy. The rooftop incident had been more than survival. It had been a demonstration of absolute control, and Mason had no idea how to respond. For Avery, the day had been another exercise in observation, patience, and silent dominance. Ridgewood Military Academy had shifted under her presence. The cadets' fear and respect were growing, and the first cracks in Alpha Squad's arrogance had appeared. She had survived, she had maintained composure, and she had silently asserted authority. Ridgewood would never be the same, and neither would Mason Hale. And as Avery settled into bed that night, eyes open but body relaxed, she knew the real work was only beginning. The cadets had revealed themselves, their weaknesses, their fears, their arrogance. Every move she had observed, every glance she had catalogued, every act of bullying had become part of her mental map. Ridgewood was no longer a battlefield of guesses. It was a board of calculated strategies, and Avery Lane always played to win. The morning sun rose over Ridgewood Military Academy, casting long shadows across the meticulously maintained grounds. The events of the past week had transformed the academy. Cadets walked with cautious awareness, whispering about the impossible survival of Avery Lane, the calm authority she wielded, and her secret identity as a Navy SEAL combat veteran. Even the instructors seemed subtly different, their respect tinged with awe, as if they themselves recognized that this was no ordinary cadet. Mason Hale and Alpha Squad gathered in the barracks, tension vibrating through every motion. The reality of their rooftop ambush, the shove, the taunt, the threat loomed over them like a storm cloud. Their arrogance, which had once defined them, had crumbled under Avery's silent dominance. Mason's pride had been shattered, replaced by a creeping fear he couldn't name. The squad's whispering was frantic, scattered, filled with both guilt and disbelief. For the first time, they realized that they had crossed a line they could never take back. Avery, meanwhile, prepared for the day's assembly with her usual calm precision. Every fold of her uniform was perfect, her hair neatly restrained, her eyes alert yet serene. She had spent years in life-or-death situations where patience, observation, and restraint were essential. Today would be no different. The cadets had revealed their intentions, their weaknesses, and their recklessness. Now it was time for accountability, silent, measured, and unequivocal. The commandant called an emergency assembly in the main courtyard. Cadets filed in, murmuring nervously. Mason and his squad sat rigidly at the front, avoiding Avery's gaze, though her presence was palpable even at the back of the formation. Commander Briggs stood beside Avery, his authority underscoring the gravity of the moment. The cadets could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. The rooftop incident, the whispers, the impossible survival. Today, consequences would be faced. The commandant's voice carried clearly across the courtyard. "Cadets of Ridgewood," he began, "the events of the past week have demonstrated a breakdown in discipline, judgment, and basic respect for your fellow cadets. Chief Petty Officer Avery Lane has been placed here to observe, evaluate, and assist in the development of discipline and conduct within this academy. Your actions have warranted a formal review." The words were precise, but the tension in the air was electric. Every cadet held their breath, unsure of what came next. Avery stepped forward, her movements controlled and deliberate. She did not speak immediately. She let her gaze sweep across the cadets, resting momentarily on each member of Alpha Squad. The silence was oppressive, a palpable force that pressed down on every nerve. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft yet commanding. What happened on the rooftop was not an accident. It was an attempt to intimidate, to harm, and to assert dominance through fear. You failed. Not only in execution, but in judgment. You underestimated the consequences of your actions, and now you will understand accountability. The cadets flinched at her words. There was no anger in her voice, no malice, only absolute authority. Mason's stomach twisted. The humiliation of the rooftop incident was nothing compared to the quiet, relentless control Avery now exerted. Every word, every pause, every glance was a subtle reminder that they had been defeated, not physically, but psychologically. She had survived their attack effortlessly, and now she would oversee the reckoning. A formal review commenced, with Avery detailing the sequence of events as she had observed them. Every shove, every whispered threat, every reckless act was catalogued meticulously. The cadets squirmed under the scrutiny. They could not hide behind excuses or bravado. Avery's calm precision left no room for denial. The facts were irrefutable. They had attempted to harm a fellow cadet, and the attempt had failed spectacularly. Commander Briggs addressed the assembly. Discipline is not merely about following orders. It is about respect, judgment, and understanding the consequences of your actions. Ridgewood Military Academy instills these values, yet some of you have tested the limits and failed. His gaze swept over Alpha Squad. Your actions will have consequences, and those consequences will be instructive. Avery's judgment was deliberate and nuanced. She did not lash out. She did not seek revenge. Instead, she imposed a series of corrective measures designed to teach respect, discipline, and awareness. Mason and his squad were required to perform additional drills under her supervision, each exercise designed to highlight precision, observation, and teamwork. They were to reflect on the consequences of overconfidence and recklessness. Failure to comply would result in additional disciplinary action. The cadets bristled, but Avery's presence made defiance impossible. Her calm authority was undeniable. Every movement, Every instruction carried the weight of someone who had faced life-or-death situations far beyond the academy's walls. The cadets realized for the first time that their arrogance had blinded them to the reality of skill, experience, and composure. They were being disciplined not with anger, but with undeniable authority. Throughout the day, Mason and his squad endured the drills. Avery moved among them, correcting mistakes with precision, demonstrating techniques, and observing every nuance of their performance. The rooftop incident was not mentioned directly, but it hung over them like a silent specter. With each corrected stance, each properly executed maneuver, their understanding deepened. Respect for Avery began to grow, though it was hesitant, reluctant, and mingled with lingering fear. By afternoon, the shift in the cadets' demeanor was noticeable. Those who had once mocked Avery now observed quietly, absorbing lessons in humility, precision, and self-awareness. Alpha Squad, once brash and fearless, had become cautious and reflective. Mason, in particular, struggled with his pride, slowly realizing that true strength was not aggression, but calm mastery, discipline, and awareness, qualities Avery embodied effortlessly. Even the instructors took note. Avery's methods were subtle, effective, and undeniable. She did not humiliate. She did not punish arbitrarily. She taught through presence, through precision, and through the unavoidable weight of her capability. Every cadet, regardless of rank or previous status, began to grasp that the rules of engagement had changed. Ridgewood was no longer merely a military academy. It was a crucible, and Avery Lane was the force shaping it. As evening approached, Mason and his squad were dismissed, exhausted but enlightened. The lessons had been delivered with clarity. Arrogance and recklessness were weaknesses. Observation, composure, and respect for skill were paramount. Avery had survived the impossible, maintained her authority, and used the experience to teach, not through anger but through methodical correction. For Mason, the realization was humbling, almost painful. Avery returned to her dorm quietly, her day complete. The cadets' whispers followed her, but now the tone had shifted. Where fear had dominated, respect began to emerge. The rooftop incident, once a moment of terror, had transformed into a teaching moment, one that would resonate throughout the academy for years to come. Alpha Squad, chastened and reflective, had begun the slow process of understanding what it truly meant to confront someone beyond their capabilities. That night, Avery reflected on the day. Ridgewood had revealed itself, its cadets, their weaknesses, their arrogance. She had cataloged every action, every misjudgment, every opportunity for growth. The academy had learned, perhaps reluctantly, that strength was not just physical. It was discipline, composure, and understanding. And Avery Lane, Navy SEAL and combat veteran, had quietly reshaped the landscape of Ridgewood Military Academy, leaving an indelible mark on every cadet who had crossed her path. Mason Hale, in particular, would carry the lessons of this day for the rest of his life. The rooftop incident, the revelation of Avery's identity, and the methodical correction that followed had dismantled his ego. He had underestimated her, failed to recognize true skill, and now understood the cost of arrogance. Ridgewood would never feel the same to him, or to any cadet who had witnessed Avery Lane's quiet authority. The morning light spilled over Ridgewood Military Academy, illuminating the drill fields and dormitories in soft gold. For the cadets, the events of the past week had changed everything. The rooftop incident, the impossible survival, and the revelation of Avery Lane's identity had shaken the foundations of the academy. Once filled with arrogance, rivalry, and casual bullying, the atmosphere now carried a heavy undertone of caution, respect, and subtle fear. Avery's presence was no longer that of a newcomer. She was a force, and every cadet instinctively knew it. Alpha Squad, still reeling from the consequences delivered by Avery, moved with noticeable restraint. Mason Hale, their leader, had transformed overnight from a brash, overconfident cadet into a cautious, analytical presence. Every action he took was measured, every command carefully considered. The rooftop incident had left a mark deeper than fear. It had instilled humility and an acute awareness of his own limitations. The other squad members mirrored his caution. their bravado replaced by vigilance. Avery arrived on the drill field just as the morning exercises began. Her movements were precise, controlled, and calm, a stark contrast to the jittery cadets around her. Even under pressure, she remained composed, her posture conveying quiet authority. Cadets who once whispered behind her back now watched closely, some with admiration, others with apprehension. Every glance, every careful movement reminded them that Avery Lane was no ordinary cadet. She embodied discipline, experience, and the unshakable confidence of someone who had survived the impossible. The instructors noticed the shift as well. Cadets who had previously ignored orders or attempted subtle forms of insubordination now moved with precision, their focus sharpened by the subtle authority Avery commanded. It was not her position, rank, or even words that enforced this change. It was her presence. She had survived a fall from a rooftop, countered attempts at humiliation, and remained unshaken in a way that no cadet and few instructors had ever witnessed. Alpha Squad began to approach Avery during the drills, their posture respectful but tentative. Mason, once ready to dominate, now found himself listening carefully, absorbing her instructions and guidance. The rooftop incident had taught him a lesson in humility. He understood, for the first time, that raw aggression was no match for composure, skill, and tactical awareness. Avery's methods were subtle, but they were profoundly effective. Each correction, each demonstration, was a lesson not only in physical technique, but in mental discipline and respect. Avery's calm authority extended beyond the physical drills. She observed, subtly correcting cadets in moments of hesitation, guiding them to understand the importance of awareness and preparedness. She did not berate or humiliate. She demonstrated, explained, and allowed the lessons to settle naturally. The cadets, initially wary, began to respond. Their movements became more precise, their decisions more thoughtful. Fear of making mistakes was replaced by a cautious admiration and a growing desire to meet her standards. By midday, whispers had transformed into quiet conversations of curiosity and awe. Cadets spoke of her survival, her composure, and the calm authority she exerted over every situation. Alpha Squad, still at the forefront, had internalized a hard truth. Respect was not demanded through threats or force. It was earned through action, discipline, and the mastery of one's own abilities. Mason had begun to see Avery not as a rival, but as a benchmark, someone whose standards were unattainable through arrogance alone. Lunchtime brought further reflection. Avery ate quietly at a table removed from the crowd, her calm composure undisturbed by the whispers and glances around her. Cadets approached hesitantly, seeking guidance or instruction, unsure whether they were allowed such familiarity. Avery acknowledged them with a small nod, a simple gesture that conveyed acknowledgement without diminishing her authority. Even in moments of apparent normalcy, her presence commanded respect. In the afternoon, tactical exercises were conducted with heightened intensity. Avery observed the cadets, noting strengths and weaknesses, correcting posture, guiding movements, and highlighting errors without a word of anger or frustration. Each correction was precise and educational. By the end of the session, cadets who had previously struggled to coordinate or execute drills now moved with cohesion, precision, and awareness that reflected her influence. The rooftop incident, once a point of terror, had become a silent benchmark of skill and composure, a reminder that underestimation carried severe consequences. Mason Hale, in particular, absorbed every lesson. His posture, once rigid with ego, now demonstrated attentiveness and humility. He recognized the error of his previous arrogance and internalized Avery's principles: patience, awareness, composure, and strategic thinking. The rooftop incident had been more than a failed attempt at intimidation. It had been a mirror, reflecting his flaws and forcing him to confront the limits of his leadership. With each drill and correction, he grew not only as a cadet, but as a person capable of understanding true skill and discipline. By evening, the academy's culture had subtly shifted. Cadets moved with more mindfulness, instructors observed smoother coordination, and whispers of awe followed Avery wherever she went. The fear she inspired had evolved into respect, still tinged with caution, but now accompanied by genuine admiration for her skill and composure. The rooftop incident had cemented her authority, but her continued presence and guidance ensured that this respect was not superficial. It was earned and internalized. Avery, reflecting on the day as she returned to her dorm, noted the changes with quiet satisfaction. The cadets' reactions, Alpha Squad's transformation, and the subtle shift in the Academy's culture confirmed that the lessons had been absorbed. She had not needed to raise her voice or resort to threats. Through calm precision, composure, and unassailable skill, she had taught a lesson that would resonate far longer than any punishment or reprimand could. Mason and his squad, returning to their dorms, were silent. Each was lost in thought, replaying the day, recalling the rooftop incident, and acknowledging the quiet authority Avery exerted over every interaction. They had come to understand that true leadership and skill were not measured in aggression or intimidation, but in control, awareness, and the ability to remain composed under pressure. Avery Lane had not only survived the impossible, she had reshaped their understanding of strength, discipline, and respect. As night fell, Ridgewood Military Academy lay in an unusual quiet. Cadets prepared for rest, their minds preoccupied with thoughts of what they had witnessed and learned. The rooftop incident, once a terrifying memory, had become a benchmark, a silent demonstration of skill, resilience, and authority. Avery's presence had shifted the balance of respect and fear within the academy, and the cadets understood, implicitly, that their actions moving forward would require careful consideration and awareness. Avery herself, lying in her bunk, remained alert yet relaxed. She had observed the cadets, assessed their weaknesses, and guided their development with precision. The rooftop incident was behind her, but its lessons endured. Fear had been instilled, respect earned, and the dynamics of the academy forever altered. She had survived the impossible and transformed Ridgewood in the process, not through anger or dominance, but through discipline, calm, and strategic authority. By the end of the 7th day, the cadets' whispering had changed. Where once they spoke in awe tinged with fear, now they spoke with measured respect. Alpha Squad, having endured correction and observation, had begun to internalize Avery's principles. Mason Hale, once consumed by arrogance, now moved with humility, awareness, and cautious leadership. The rooftop incident remained a silent testament to Avery's authority, a warning and a benchmark rolled into one. Avery Lane had achieved more than survival. She had earned the respect of the entire academy while instilling a lasting awareness of skill, discipline, and consequence. Ridgewood would never forget the week she had arrived, and Mason, along with every cadet who had crossed her path, would carry the lessons learned, aware that underestimating her was a mistake that could never be repeated. The first light of dawn broke over Ridgewood Military Academy, casting long, golden beams across the meticulously maintained campus. The cadets moved with purpose, their footsteps echoing across the parade grounds. The events of the past week, the rooftop incident, Avery Lane's impossible survival, and the revelation of her true identity as a Navy SEAL combat veteran, had left an indelible mark on the academy. Where once arrogance, rivalry, and petty bullying had defined life at Ridgewood, there was now a tangible air of respect, discipline, and cautious admiration. Alpha Squad had changed the most. Mason Hale, once brash and overconfident, had become a model of restraint and reflection. He moved with measured precision, constantly aware of the standards Avery had set. Every decision, every action, every order he gave reflected the lessons he had absorbed: respect for skill, patience, and composure under pressure. His squad mirrored his transformation, and even those cadets who had previously ignored rules now followed their example, inspired by the clarity and calm authority Avery embodied. Avery walked through the campus, her presence commanding attention without a word. Cadets who had once whispered insults or plotted schemes now watched her silently, observing her every motion. Her authority was not based on intimidation or force. It was a natural consequence of skill, experience, and unshakable composure. To the cadets, she had become a living standard, a benchmark for discipline, precision, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. During morning drills, Avery demonstrated her mastery not through force but through guidance. She corrected stances, refined movements, and provided subtle instruction, all while maintaining her trademark calm. Cadets absorbed her lessons, performing with a cohesion and awareness that had previously been unimaginable. The rooftop incident had become a silent lesson embedded in their minds. Underestimate her, and the consequences would be immediate, precise, and undeniable. Commander Briggs observed from the sidelines, his expression a mix of pride and satisfaction. Avery had not only survived impossible circumstances, but had reshaped the Academy's culture through quiet authority. The cadets' respect, though initially tinged with fear, was now genuine. They were learning not only the technical aspects of military discipline, but also the intangible qualities of composure, strategic awareness, and respect for true skill. By midday, the Academy's energy had shifted subtly but irrevocably. Cadets moved with a newfound focus. Alpha Squad, once the most disruptive, now led by example. Mason Hale walked with a humility that was once foreign to him, correcting minor mistakes in his squad with measured precision, echoing the lessons Avery had silently imparted. Even the instructors noted the improvement. Discipline was no longer enforced by authority alone. It was internalized by the cadets themselves. Lunchtime offered a moment of reflection. Cadets clustered in quiet conversation, speaking in hushed tones about Avery's skills, her composure, and her experiences. The rooftop incident had become legend, a story repeated and dissected with awe. Cadets speculated on the unimaginable training she must have undergone, the impossible missions she had survived, and the calm presence she maintained in every situation. Her influence extended far beyond her immediate actions. It was shaping their understanding of discipline, strategy, and respect. Afternoon tactical exercises highlighted the transformation most vividly. Under Avery's observation, cadets executed maneuvers with precision, coordination, and awareness. Mistakes were corrected calmly, errors discussed and analyzed rather than punished, and the lessons became embedded in every movement. Alpha Squad, once the aggressors, now excelled as a cohesive unit, their performance reflecting both the technical guidance and the psychological lessons imparted by Avery. The rooftop incident, now recast in their minds as a test of skill and composure, served as a constant reminder of the standards they were expected to meet. Mason Hale paused during a drill to watch Avery demonstrate a complex maneuver. Every detail, every nuance was executed flawlessly. He realized, with a mix of humility and awe, that he had witnessed true mastery. The rooftop incident had been more than survival. It had been a demonstration of authority, skill, and composure that demanded recognition and respect. Avery's influence had reshaped not only his squad but the broader culture of Ridgewood Military Academy. As evening fell, Avery returned to her dorm, the day's lessons settling into the cadets' minds. Ridgewood had become more than a military academy. It was now a place where discipline, awareness, and respect were internalized rather than imposed. The rooftop incident had shifted the academy's equilibrium, and Avery Lane had ensured that the lessons endured beyond a single day or a single confrontation. Cadets had learned, through observation and subtle correction, that true skill and authority could not be challenged lightly. The transformation was perhaps most visible in Alpha Squad. Mason Hale, previously consumed by arrogance, now demonstrated genuine humility. He approached each exercise with focus, precision, and awareness, guiding his squad in a manner reflective of Avery's principles. Their confidence, once misplaced, had been recalibrated through direct exposure to skill, composure, and authority. They were no longer reckless. They were disciplined, cautious, and capable, a reflection of the standards Avery had instilled. By nightfall, Ridgewood's campus settled into an unusual quiet. Cadets reflected on the lessons learned, The rooftop incident replayed in their minds not as a source of fear alone, but as a testament to mastery and authority. Avery Lane's presence had transformed the academy, leaving a lasting imprint on every cadet who had encountered her. Fear had evolved into respect, discipline had been internalized, and the culture of Ridgewood had been reshaped fundamentally. Avery herself, lying in her bunk, remained alert yet composed. The rooftop incident, the cadets' reactions, and the lessons she had imparted were all cataloged and analyzed. She knew the influence she had established would endure, not because of punishment or intimidation, but because she had demonstrated quietly and precisely the standards required to survive and excel in any environment. The cadets' transformation was the proof. Respect earned, fear realized, authority established. For Mason Hale, the rooftop incident would remain a defining moment. It had revealed his limitations, taught him humility, and reshaped his understanding of leadership. He had come to appreciate not only Avery's extraordinary abilities, but also the subtle, quiet authority she wielded. The incident had become a benchmark, a reference point for his personal growth, and a reminder that arrogance could be dangerous, and skill could be transformative. In the days that followed, Avery continued to influence the academy. Cadets moved with precision, awareness, and respect. Alpha Squad, once disruptive and reckless, had become disciplined and focused. The rooftop incident, once terrifying, had become a symbol of authority, composure, and mastery, a legend that would be recounted and respected for years. Avery Lane had not only survived the impossible, but had ensured that every cadet understood the consequences of underestimating skill, courage, and composure. As the sun set over Ridgewood Military Academy, Avery stood quietly on the drill field, watching the cadets execute maneuvers with precision and discipline. The transformation was complete. Fear had evolved into respect, respect into discipline, and discipline into mastery. The legacy of the rooftop incident would endure, not as a moment of terror, but as a symbol of authority, skill, and the indelible mark one extraordinary individual could leave on an entire institution. Avery Lane had survived the impossible, transformed her adversaries, and reshaped the academy. The cadets, instructors, and even the administration had learned a vital lesson. Skill, composure, and quiet authority were forces far more powerful than arrogance, recklessness, or intimidation. Ridgewood would never be the same, and the legacy of that rooftop fall, the moment when a Navy SEAL combat veteran defied expectation, would resonate for years to come. The academy was quiet now, the cadets resting, the campus settling under the twilight sky. Yet the lesson remained vivid: underestimate Avery Lane at your peril. She had earned respect, instilled discipline, and left a legacy that would endure. And as she looked toward the horizon, calm, composed, and unshakable, Avery knew that her influence had only begun, and Ridgewood Military Academy had been irrevocably changed.